Our culture has romanticized the vampire. We've dressed it in velvet and silver, and painted it with charm and sorrow. But long before Hollywood, before Edward Cullen or cinematic fascination, the vampire was something much darker. It was not born from fantasy, but from the real implications of heathenistic practices. It derived from sacrilegious blood rituals, necromantic practices, and the desperate grab of seeking immortality without God. Since the dawn of time, blood has been considered sacred in almost every religion and culture. It is life-sustaining and withholds a supernatural component. In Christianity, God prohibits the consumption of blood in the Old Testament, as it is the source of life, and the blood of animals was used as sacrificial atonement. And across the world, blood has always been considered sacred. In different ancient religions, blood has been used as an offering to feed entities. It's been viewed as a vessel connecting body and spirit, and it's been thought to be the answer to elongating life. And within these dark corners of world theology, the ones who drank the blood did not see themselves as monsters, but as seekers of power, exalting themselves above all others. Across ancient cultures like Mesopotamia and Greece, similar malevolent entities preyed on the blood of the innocent. Demonic spirits consumed it to regain strength. Cannibalistic giants wreaked havoc on humanity, and specific demons, like Lilith, a winged seductress, spiritually drained men and preyed on sleeping infants in their cribs, consuming their blood. This is considered one of the tales that originated the concept of the vampire, and blood sacrifice in one way or another has always been a component in most religions, and the consumption of it in like manner derives from an open rebellion to the Creator. After Christ gave his life on the cross, his blood was used to purify mankind of their sins, and those who sought to rebel against God consumed the blood of the innocent in hopes to find their own strength in life. Vampirism evolved into an open rebellion against God. It became the embodiment of sin, defilement, and defiance. It became the antithesis of the work of Jesus Christ. He gave his blood to save mankind, while these entities took blood to save themselves. The supernatural significance of blood became more and more tempting to humanity, birthing cults that looked to harness its energy. Different occult groups took this concept and have been practicing it ever since, keeping these ancient evils alive. It's believed to have led to disease, undead victims, and villages losing families one by one, leading to whispers of monsters feeding on them. Vampiric horrors followed mankind from ancient Mesopotamian myths to quiet Puritan villages. Vampires are not just creatures of folklore, but real monsters woven into our history. This is the story of vampires in New England. The definition of a vampire has become an undead being said to rise from its grave to feed upon the living. It drained life through consuming the blood and the energy of its victim, and those who would perish would be cursed to become one. In the 18th and 19th centuries, New England was gripped by a plague without cure. Small villages experienced huge portions of their population perishing, but it did not look like a disease to them. Victims would lie there, pale and lifeless, blood around their lips with a collapsed face. Historians now believe this plague to have been tuberculosis, but at this time it was an undiscovered lethal disease that the settlers called consumption, because it seemed to consume the body and soul. But regardless if tuberculosis was the case, there were many reports of victims back then whose corpses were too fresh to seem dead, still filled with blood and skin still warm, as if their body was still alive and functioning. People reported strange noises coming from graveyards, and dark figures were spotted roaming the cemeteries. Their children cried that dead people had visited them at night. Theories believed that the plague was real but used as a disguise so that the vampires could feast. Livestock was reported to be drained of blood. Villagers were found dead in their fields, and some people just up and vanished. The evidence stacked up, and the idea of vampires was still widely accepted, so the New Englanders needed to put a stop to it. There were no trials for vampires. The accused could not be confronted or executed because they were already dead, but instead there were rituals to get rid of them. Communities came together and would quietly dig up the accused person's grave. After digging them up and unsealing the coffin, they observed the corpse for these signs: flesh still rosy or pink, hair and nails that continued to grow, and red liquid still in the heart. Each of these signs would indicate that the deceased corpse still held life, and when the signs were found, the heart and sometimes the liver were cut out and burned in a designated spot within the cemetery. The ashes of these organs were then mixed into a drink, believed to be an elixir to heal the sick as a desperate effort to remove the curse. It was a frantic attempt to saving their loved ones, born from terrifying circumstances. These rituals were generally kept quiet, but sometimes documented in newspapers or diaries. Again and again, bodies were found with hearts that seemed alive, blood that had not dried, and faces that looked ruddy and flush. Skeptics think that the cold winters preserved these corpses, slowing the decay. Blood pooled in the chest, giving the illusion of feeding, and skin shrank, exposing hair and nails, making them appear to grow. Perhaps the most well-documented of one of these cases comes from Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892. The Brown family was torn apart by consumption. First, George Brown lost his wife, Mary, then his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, and soon after, another daughter, Mercy. When his only son, Edwin, grew desperately ill, neighbors began to whisper. They spoke of the old word, vampire. At first, George resisted. He was a man of reason, not superstition. But as Edwin slipped further toward death, the pressure from villagers grew unbearable, and so reluctantly, George Brown gave in to their demands. In the bitter cold of March, the Brown family graves were opened. Mary Brown and Mary Olive had long since decayed, but when Mercy's coffin was lifted from the earth, the villagers gasped. Her body appeared strangely preserved. Her face was still flush, her heart still held blood. To them, it was undeniable proof. Mercy Brown had risen from the grave as a vampire. On a flat stone nearby, her heart and liver were cut out and burned to ash. The remains were mixed into a bitter tonic, which was then given to Edwin in a desperate attempt to break the curse. Unfortunately, the ritual failed, and Edwin died just 2 months later. And unlike some of the earlier vampire rituals, Mercy Brown's case was widely reported. Newspapers across New England and even as far as London published sensational accounts of the Exeter vampire. To some, it was proof that the superstition still held sway over rural America, and to others it was a reminder of how terrifying consumption had become. But this is not the end of Mercy's story. For generations, visitors to Chestnut Hill Cemetery have claimed strange experiences at her grave. Some say they feel a sudden drop in temperature, as if a cold hand brushed against them. Others hear whispers in the winter wind and murmurs that seem to circle the stones. There are those who swear they have seen Mercy's ghost, pale with hollow eyes wandering between the graves. These stories and folklore have become an intricate part of Exeter's DNA. They have kept the present of Mercy Brown alive and turned her grave into both a site of mourning and a site of haunting. Today, Mercy Brown is remembered as America's last vampire. Her headstone is often marked with flowers, coins, and offerings left by those who visit. Folklorists believe her case may even have reached Bram Stoker. In his Notes for Dracula, published just 5 years later, clippings about New England vampires appear, suggesting that Mercy's story may have helped shape the world's most famous vampire novel. Her legend lives on in scholarship, in paranormal tourism, and in whispers of the supernatural. In the mid-19th century, the quiet mill town of Jewett City, Connecticut became the stage of one of New England's most haunting vampire stories. At the center was a single family, the Rays. The Ray family lived on the outskirts of Griswold, near Jewett City. Like so many farming families of the time, they worked on the land, lived in close quarters, and carried with them fear and folk traditions of old New England. In 1845, tragedy struck. Henry Ray, a young man, died of consumption. It was the beginning of a slow, merciless wave. Over the next several years, more of Henry's brothers fell to the same wasting disease. Each of them grew pale, gaunt, coughing blood until they wasted away to nothing. To the surviving family, it was as if death itself had taken up residence in their home. As more Ray men fell ill, the community began to worry. They believed that one of the dead brothers had not truly died, but was instead rising from his grave to feed on the living. In this case, suspicion fell not on one, but on several of the deceased. The village believed that multiple members of the Ray family were preying on their own kin from beyond the grave. The solution was brutal but familiar. In May of 1854, the townsfolk of Jewett City descended on the cemetery where the Rays were buried. One by one, several Ray family graves were opened. Witnesses described how the corpses were lifted from the ground and their remains burned on the spot. Piles of bones and ash were left in the cemetery itself, a warning to any other vampire that might linger. This was not a rumor. It was recorded in local papers, it was seen by neighbors, and it was accepted by the town as a necessary act. Today, Jewett City stands alongside Exeter, Rhode Island, and Woodstock, Vermont, as one of the central locations in New England's vampire panic. Unlike the Mercy Brown case, where a single girl was accused, the Ray family exhumations involved multiple corpses and the participation of an entire community. For that reason, Jewett City is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in America's vampire history, a place where fear of the dead led the living to set fire to their own kin. And though Rhode Island is remembered for America's last vampire, it was Vermont that saw the most. From the late 1700s through the mid-1800s, reports of vampire exhumations appeared again and again across the Green Mountain State. More than anywhere else in New England, Vermonters embraced the desperate ritual of digging up their dead and setting fire to their hearts. One of the best documented cases from Vermont comes from Woodstock. In the 1830s, a young man named Horace Ray, same last name as the Jewett City vampires, fell sick with consumption. As his health declined, neighbors urged his father to take action. Their belief was simple. One of Horace's brothers, who was already buried, was draining the life out of him. Reluctantly, Horace's father consented, the grave was opened, the body exhumed. A blacksmith's forge was fired, and before a crowd of villagers, the organs were cut from the corpse and burned in the flames. The ashes were collected and given to Horace as the elixir, but, like so many before him, Horace died after. But the Ray family was not alone. Across Vermont, similar stories were recorded. In Manchester, the town historian noted at least one family that carried out vampire exhumation after losing several children to tuberculosis. In Weathersfield, villagers dug up the grave of a young woman after her sister began showing signs of consumption. Witnesses swore her heart was full of blood. It was cut out and burned. In Woodstock and surrounding towns, oral traditions recall multiple cases of hearts being destroyed, sometimes in the presence of dozens of villagers who treated the ritual as both medicine and spectacle. These weren't isolated moments of hysteria, they were a pattern. Vermonters repeatedly turned to vampire cures through the 18th and 19th centuries. But why was Vermont so prominent? Why were there so many stories that clustered here? Historians point to isolation. Vermont's mountain towns were small, rural, and cut off from the advances of urban medicine, so old world beliefs held stronger in these communities. But some point to that being the very reason that there is an uptick in witchcraft and vampirism in Vermont itself, that these old world traditions continued on. And in modern days, with the dozens of documented exhumations in the Green Mountains, folklorists have given Vermont the chilling title as the vampire capital of America. Today, old cemeteries across the state still whisper with that history. Paranormal investigators search for signs of the rituals. Visitors leave offerings at forgotten graves, and in some villages the tale of the vampire cure is still told as if it only happened yesterday. Here in the Green Mountains, the line between folklore and history is thin. The terrifying monsters of myth were their reality. The vampiric energy of New England has never truly died. Over a century later, the stories still fascinate. Mercy Brown's grave in Exeter draws visitors year-round. Ghost hunters and folklorists walk the same cemeteries where hearts were once burned, and authors and filmmakers continue to retell these legends, blending fact with fiction. But these stories from the 19th century are not all the vampiric history in New England. Long after the ancient temples fell and tales of Lilith and Lamia were drowned out of history, the esoteric practices around blood never vanished. It's been hidden from the public eye and has been passed down through alchemists, mystics, and occult fraternities who believe that within blood could lay the key to divine transformation. The Rosicrucians spoke of the red tincture, a hidden elixir of life created not from gold but from the essence of the human soul. To them, blood is the link between flesh and spirit. Freemasons, Hermetic orders, and Theosophists explored similar ideas. The concept of vital magnetism, the energy of life that could be absorbed, transferred, or stolen. In certain occult circles, this evolved into the doctrine of the living vampire, those who could feed upon the subtle life energy to sustain youth, health, and power. And since the 19th century to today, spiritualism has swept through America and Europe, and this ancient concept reawakened in a new form. The seance tables replaced the altars, the medium replaced the priests, and once again the veil between the living and dead is said to be thin. Some whispered that certain participants, those pale and unaging, were not contacting spirits at all, but feeding upon the living energy gathered in those rooms. In New England, whispers of vampires continue. Some gather in what are known as vampire houses or clans, tight-knit communities that mix Gothic subculture with rituals. Some attempt to bring back the ways of the ancient practices, and others have no idea what they're messing with. Some have adopted ideologies around the sacredness and spiritual significance of blood. It has led to individuals claiming that they must drink blood or draw psychic energy from others to maintain their health and balance. Some find willing donors who allow small amounts of bloodletting, treating it as both spiritual and intimate. Many folklorists, paranormal researchers, and occult researchers have long whispered about vampire cults in New England, secretive circles that have carried out these practices to present day. And though hard proof is rare, fragments of reports, police files, and oral histories paint a chilling picture of blood rituals, nocturnal gatherings, and modern echoes of the region's darkest fears. In Providence, Rhode Island, the city forever tied to Mercy Brown, the so-called last New England vampire, the rumors took on new life in the 80s and 90s. Goth nightclubs like the Asylum and the Living Room became breeding grounds for strange subcultures, people who didn't dress like vampires but lived as them. Behind closed doors, whispers spoke of vampire houses, secret groups meeting in rented basements or abandoned mills. Members claimed ancient lineages tracing themselves to those who once exhumed the dead to stop consumption. Police logs have mentioned desecrated graves and strange symbols painted in blood-like pigment near Exeter and Providence cemeteries. Though they were only labeled as vandalism, some investigators quietly suspected occult involvement. Locals told stories of blood-drinking rituals said to renew vitality or bind members together in oaths. Few places in America carry a darker reputation than the Bridgewater Triangle, a 200-square-mile zone of high strangeness in southeastern Massachusetts. Freetown State Forest, at its core, is a magnet for tales of the occult, with satanic altars, animal sacrifices, and strange lights in the trees. In the late 1970s to the early 1980s, police discovered makeshift ritual sites consisting of circles of stones, burned animal remains, and inverted symbols carved into the ledges. There were also multiple murders that were documented as directly tied to occult rituals. While most investigators blamed satanic cults, some whispered of vampire sects, small splinter groups who broke off from wider occult scene, performing rituals focused not on demons but on blood and vitality, which would also help explain some of the mutilated animals found years later, completely drained of blood. And one witness from secondhand reports in the 1990s described seeing figures in black robes performing blood rituals by candlelight near Profile Rock, and another claimed to find a stone altar with goblets still sticky with red residue. And back in rural Connecticut, stories of secret vampire covens persisted well into the 20th century. Folklorists collecting oral histories in the 1970s and 80s heard chilling accounts of isolated families who believed they were touched by the old curse. Some claimed to reenact protective rites, spilling animal blood on stones to ward off illness. Others describe more theatrical ceremonies. Mock exhumations performed as initiations, symbolizing rebirth through darkness. A few locals even claim these families were descendants of those who burned corpses during the tuberculosis outbreaks, carrying the vampire legacy as part of their lineage. Whether these stories were fact, exaggeration, or fear transformed through generations, they hint at something unsettling: that the belief in vampiric power, the hunger, contagion, and forbidden vitality never truly vanished from New England's hidden corners. And in Boston, the vampire myth evolved, shifting from backwoods panic to urban identity. By the 1990s, a thriving Gothic and industrial subculture was pulsing beneath the city's nightlife. Here, several groups calling themselves houses or clans began identifying as vampires. Some dubbed themselves sanguinarians, individuals who drank small amounts of blood from consenting partners, claiming it eased exhaustion or psychic pain. Others were psychic vampires who said they fed on emotional or life energy. These communities had hierarchy, initiation rituals, and codes of conduct. They called it a religion of essence. Outsiders, however, knew it was a cult. Journalists and sociologists who infiltrated these cults in the early 2000s described private gatherings with candlelit ceremonies, bloodletting among consenting members, and mythologies drawn from both Gothic literature and ancient occult texts. And while most of these groups insist their practices are safe, symbolic, or spiritual, the blurred line between performance and belief gives the Boston scene its eerie, lingering mystique. As our culture has evolved, something strange began to happen. What once terrified entire villages, what once drove families to exhume their dead and burn their hearts to stop a plague, has been transformed into fashion, entertainment, and identity. From Hollywood to literature, from music to nightlife, vampirism has been romanticized, stripped of its horror, and repackaged as a lure. But beneath the surface, these practices have roots buried in darkness, in necromancy, blood rituals, and occult traditions that sought to manipulate the very essence of life and death. When people drink blood today, even in so-called symbolic or consensual ways, they are reenacting rites that once sprang from desperation, fear, and death. When spiritual movements invoke energy feeding, or blood as a source of vitality, they echo the same forces that drove 19th century families to desecrate graves in the hope of warding off the undead. This is not harmless play. It's the aestheticization of suffering, the glorification of rituals once meant to fight a curse. And although imagination and fantasy is fun, our society has forgotten that these stories came from pain, from disease, madness, and grief, twisted into ritual. In embracing the vampire as a symbol of beauty or rebellion, we risk celebrating the very darkness our ancestors fought so hard against. Because at its core, vampirism has always been about consumption. One life feeding upon another. And when a culture begins to flirt with that kind of darkness, even symbolically, it opens doors better to be left closed. So as you walk among New England's old graveyards, remember, these legends were not born from myth, but from real terror.